Time once again for a Jeffrey Epstein segment where we talk about that dude who committed suicide 7 years ago. A $35 billion deal for Egypt to buy Israeli oil was announced late last year, and the oil is going to be produced through the Leviathan oil field. Behind the scenes, it's a way to reinforce the Camp David Accords, and those Camp David Accords have been highly stressed by the genocide in Gaza. But the way that this relates to Epstein is that Jeffrey Epstein arranged meetings between Netanyahu and executives from JP Morgan leadership about developing the Leviathan oil field. Because while Leviathan produces quite a bit of oil this day, the oil field was actually only discovered in 2010 and is estimated to have 500 billion cubic meters of oil. So between the Leviathan field being discovered in 2010 and it being an actual producer of oil, the oil field itself actually had to be developed. But there was only one problem with developing the oil field in the first place. The owners of the oil field could not proceed as a monopoly under Israeli law. In the mid-2010s, the entire oil field was basically monopolized by a company called Delek. And one way for Delek to get around this Israeli law was for it to get some international investors to make it not a monopoly. So during this obstacle to getting Leviathan up and running, there's two main actors trying to get it done by different methods. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to use the full force of the executive to just get it done, while Ehud Barak is looking for these international investors to skirt around the fact that Delek has a monopoly. It's at this point that Netanyahu allows Delek to own Leviathan if it sells its stake in any of its domestic oil production. In fact, Netanyahu's own son was caught at a strip club drunkenly talking about the corrupt bargain. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested the second time in 2019 and then eventually is found dead in his jail cell, JP Morgan did an internal audit of Epstein-related exposures that it might have. It called this internal audit Project Jeep. I am happy to say that I put this together myself. The JE in Jeep is for Jeffrey and the EP is for Epstein. So essentially it's like Project Jeffrey Epstein. And one thing they found very blatantly and clearly was that Epstein had set up a bunch of meetings between JP Morgan executives and members of the Israeli government, and even Netanyahu himself. And the meetings that were set up were indeed to talk about the development of the Leviathan oil field. Netanyahu's attempt at using the executive to get his way doesn't exactly work at first. As Ehud Barak and Epstein are trying to get international investors in the oil field, Netanyahu starts to turn it into a national security issue, vowing to not let the enemies of Israel take the oil field or do damage to it. And so by turning it into a national security issue, Netanyahu hoped to skirt around the monopoly law. However, something comes to really bite them in the ass. Operation Protective Edge, which killed 2,000 Palestinians in Gaza, started in part because of threats to the Leviathan oil field. You see, while the oil field sits off the coast of Israel, one thing that's in between parts of Israel and the field itself is Gaza. The decision to move from a Warsaw Ghetto strategy of Gaza to outright ethnic cleansing and genocide is partly because of wanting to protect the Leviathan oil field, and more sinisterly, to not allow Palestinians or Hamas to develop their own oil. Operation Protective Edge ends up spelling death for the Leviathan development, along with other factors like protests in Amman over Jordan purchasing stolen gas from Israel. There's even a deal on the table at one point from Russia during the Syrian civil war to use Gazprom, which is the biggest oil company in Russia, to purchase part of Leviathan and then promise protection from Hezbollah and Hamas with the full might of the Russian military behind it. Instead, Netanyahu actually succeeds in protecting the Delek monopoly over the Leviathan oil fields in December 2015, politically protecting it through the National Security Clause. And by 2019, you have the first amounts of oil start to trickle out of the Levant. One of the biggest reasons that we're even in the Middle East in the first place is definitely oil. One of the ways that we project our power into the Middle East is through Israel. So we kind of kill two birds with one stone with having oil that's produced from Israel. So in conclusion, Jeffrey Epstein set up a bunch of meetings between Netanyahu and the JP Morgan executives, also Ehud Barak. And also JP Morgan was one of the underwriters for the Leviathan investments that went forward. Epstein, and you can see this in the emails between him and Ehud Barak, but Epstein is actually coaching Ehud Barak on how to sell these oil fields to foreign investors, how to do his due diligence. And this basically confirms that decision-making on the world stage, within the confines, especially of neoliberalism, are really made by gentlemen with cigars in back rooms. Mountains are literally moved with a wink and a handshake, and Jeffrey Epstein isn't an anomaly in this system. He's a perfect representative. One of the larger developments in Middle East politics in the past 15 years, which is the discovery of this Leviathan oil field, ends up having Jeffrey Epstein's handprints all over it once again, as we discover him once more to be the Forrest Gump of conspiracy theories.